realizarse charlas informales entre las mujeres que habían sido víctimas y en un momento determinado se dio un paso más y estas mujeres decidieron que querían llevar a los criminales a los tribunales. Se creó el Tribunal de la Conciencia, era un tribunal simbólico, en un juicio simbólico en el que estas mujeres dieron su testimonio y un juez simbólico dio unas sentencias. Los organizadores me pidieron que investigara qué ocurría en las zonas urbanas, porque como ya he dicho era algo muy silenciado, y me centré en el caso de la desaparición de una mujer. Mi intención era encontrar pruebas de la participación de la policía y de agentes de inteligencia en la desaparición de esta mujer y también encontrar evidencias de si había sido víctima de violencia sexual. Cuando presenté los resultados, pude mostrar que sí que había habido participación de la policía y de agentes de inteligencia en su desaparición, pero no había encontrado información en los archivos de la policía que consulté sobre el hecho de que ella hubiera sido víctima de violencia sexual. Lo que sí encontré fue el testimonio de un hombre que había estado retenido en un centro de tortura ilegal con ella y al que ella le había contado que sí, la habían violado numerosas veces y le habían aplicado electroshocks en la vagina y en los pechos. El Tribunal de Conciencia declaró que estos crímenes sexuales, la violencia sexual, era parte de la estrategia de la guerra. Y algunas familias, incluso la familia de esta mujer, está planteándose la posibilidad de dar un paso más allá, de llevar a los supuestos criminales ante la justicia. Tienen las suficientes pruebas para ello, pero es duro porque es algo traumático y también tienen miedo de la posible represión. Las mujeres mayas, que también sufrieron violaciones, dieron hace unas pocas semanas su primer testimonio ante un tribunal, pero también tienen miedo de la represión. Y para terminar, lo que me gustaría decirles es que las consecuencias de estas atrocidades siguen estando presentes en la sociedad de hoy en día, que cada año alrededor de 700 mujeres son víctimas de femicidio, las matan por el hecho de ser mujeres. Y es algo, además, la violencia sexual contra las mujeres que pasa hoy en día. Mujeres en Guatemala sufren violaciones, mutilaciones y las asesinan y sus cuerpos los dejan visibles en espacios públicos. Si no nos ocupamos de la historia, los crímenes se repetirán y actualmente se siguen repitiendo. Gracias.
Many thanks to everybody for being here, and special thanks to Marcia, Professor Espada, for giving me this incredible honor to have a chance to learn about this specific series of historical atrocities that still remain a reality. As we've heard from Virginia, it's such an eloquent testimony, and part of which is also a result of this beautiful translation, as I hear. And I'd like to also thank everybody, not only in this room, including Sonia, Lydia, and Aida, and Susan for making this all possible, but also those beyond John Jay and watching us and hearing us, and beyond Guatemala, and whoever is sort of is paying attention to these issues. And I guess I'll be speaking first as somebody who is learning about these concrete details, but also perhaps as somebody who's been trained a little bit in philosophy. So it is a position of ignorance that I think is extremely important. And so I'm going to ask a couple of questions that are meant to sort of be a way for us to perhaps beginning to ask some questions. So it's my way of understanding how to start thinking about and contemplating on the scars that we all share, whoever we are. I guess that's the question that really interests me. So specifically, before I came here, I had two ideas as a kind of preamble. Having also heard some of the stories beforehand, I had this sort of two sort of formulations. I mean, philosophers like to think in propositions, right? The first one was this. As many of you are already familiar with this idea, we say history repeats itself. But the point of studying history is to be able to recognize the point at which perhaps we can stop just that, right? How do we intervene in that process of perpetuated injustice and problems, right? So we cannot stop what's happening, but our contribution, whether it's intellectual or practical or everyday or in a general sense, is always an attempt to try and prevent and be able to see further. So we are studying history for future, in other words, right? And so I see this structure of perpetuation that we see in this, capitalism, legacy of capitalism, legacy of colonialism, legacy of inter-Guatemalan this sort of politics, all concentrated in this violence directed against the body of women, extremely, almost unbearably compelling because of the layers of repetition. So that was the idea that I had. And the second thing is this, is sort of coming out of more kind of old-fashioned Marxian point, where he says the point of theory, okay, I talked about history, but now theory. What is the point of theory? Some of you students here probably know. Point of theory is not simply to understand the world, but to change it, right? To transform it, right? So it's related to the question about history, right? So why do we even learn history as well as theory? The point is to change it, right? Now, what I found extremely interesting, also helpful, is to hear the stories, right, from Virginia, right, and also and the stories that we've just seen, from the film, where one of the scenes, the sort of moments that I found incredibly moving is when these women were asked who was raped, right, and you see a sliver of that hesitation, and then somebody raised hand, right? Who was raped, right? This is a moment of recognition. How does one begin to terms with the reality that's been oppressing them, right? But this courage with which they're able to say, I was raped, right? And then gradually you begin to see people stepping forward, right? And I find that moment really moving, right? In the sense that this is a kind of the mode of breaking the silence, right? That becomes part of the movement that is not simply localized, right, in this particular location, but becomes a kind of movement of the ripple effects, right? So how do we recognize this moment of recognition as a point for which political and ethical engagement with the problems of injustice can emerge? So I just like to draw attention again to those moments where Virginia talks about the scars, right? How this trauma, the moments of trauma become the fabric of reality that's changed forever, right? And what I find so interesting in her again, I mean, I'd love to meet her. I hope she's also watching and listening to us. This sort of incredibly philosophical, this reflection, right, on the implications of experience, right? In other words, it's a lesson for us, whoever you're again, like, why do we need to engage in this issue that happened a long time ago and in different parts of the world, right? It's an imperative towards global justice in the way that I think about it. And I have about three sort of specific questions, a little bit more specific, but I'd like to offer that as my sort of opening reflection, if that's possible for you to translate. Yeah. Okay.
Muchas gracias a todos, muchas gracias profesora Esparza por invitarme, muchas gracias a todos los que están aquí, a todos los que están allende las fronteras escuchándonos. Es un honor para mí estar aquí con ustedes hoy. Me gustaría compartir con ustedes mis reflexiones como alguien que está aprendiendo y como alguien que tiene cierta formación en filosofía, pero entiendan que parto desde una posición de ignorancia al respecto. Me gustaría lanzarles unas cuantas preguntas para que empecemos a abordar este tema desde un punto de vista quizá un poco más filosófico. Antes de venir tenía dos ideas que me gustaría lanzarles. La primera es que la historia se repite y cómo podemos intervenir en evitar ese proceso de perpetuación de las injusticias. No es algo que podamos detener directamente, pero parte de nuestra contribución intelectual, académica, es ver más allá. Y en segundo lugar, quería abordar no solo la historia, sino también desde una concepción un poco marxista. ¿Cuál es el objetivo de la teoría? La teoría no sirve solo para entender el mundo, sino para cambiarlo. Para mí ha sido muy interesante y de gran ayuda escuchar las historias de Virginia y los testimonios que nos ha presentado Sonia. Ha sido especialmente conmovedor ver cuando en el vídeo a las mujeres se les preguntaba quién ha sido violada, y había un momento de duda, de indecisión, pero al final empezaban a levantar las manos. Ese momento de reconocimiento público que demuestra un gran valor de esas mujeres que estaban dando la cara y reconociendo que habían sido violadas. Creo que es una lección para todos nosotros y nos demuestra lo importante que es que nos comprometamos desde el punto de vista político, desde el punto de vista ético, porque al fin y al cabo el trauma se convierte en una realidad, esas cicatrices de las que hablaba Virginia. Me gustaría lanzarles ahora una serie de preguntas para que podamos empezar a abordar este tema.
Thank you. While listening to this series of reflections and reports and testimonies, I began to think about, say, 3 questions that I could immediately perhaps convert into some kind of tasks. So what do we do, right? So the first one is something like this. We've been hearing this mass atrocities, right? This mass atrocities. Mass, when you think about mass, this is a scientific term, right? It's almost like a humus, right? It's mass, right? It's a scientific term, right? And now, when you combine that with atrocities, right, it becomes this sort of question of this countless, this just beyond the measure, right? Right? This sort of massive attack, as we say, or mass destruction, right? This is a collateral, right? This sort of, I'm really curious about that kind of, say, the question of massiveness of this sort of, the modern warfare, right? That you begin to see in the Cold War, and in light of this, and you have this sort of, the legacy of that repeating itself. Now, so the question is this. This is in part out of, as I said, my own ignorance. I had a very little idea of what was going on, but thanks to the friends, I got to learn about a little bit of this. So again, back to the question of ignorance, right? So who can speak of this mass atrocities against what I would call mass ignorance, right? Just massive ignorance. The question is, I kept asking myself, why is that I did not know anything about this so far, right? This is, I guess, philosophers are trained, at least they don't really know anything. But at least we know when to detect the ignorance becomes mutual, right? Why are we ignoring that particular ignorance? I think we are sensitive, at least, to that point, right? So now the question is this. This is what I link to this, for instance, someone like Martin Luther King in the US, right? Where he says, injustice here is injustice everywhere, right? Injustice, micro-injustice, problems, everyday experience that we experience in our own environment, right? Has connections to everything, right, happening in the world, right? So it's that kind of sort of almost cognitive solidarity, if you like, right, with things that are happening in the world. So instead of just talking about mass atrocities, right, that is a kind of a very useful kind of way to think about, this unthinkable, right? We have to think, we have to pay attention to this sort of massiveness of it. But now the task is, we have to pitch it against the mass ignorance, right, as it was. So how do we then go through case by case, right, and make sure that this
stuff that we talk about, right, is done justice to. Right? So it's important to catalog and pay attention to every single case. So we need to be able to singularize, right, each and every case. And this leads to what I will talk about in the third sort of sentence. I mean, the question about, like I said, who can actually then address this issue. So that's the first one. If I can just go on to 2, 3, that would be okay. Okay. So this is something that I want to just read a little bit too. And because I think in whatever language that we are operating in, this is a sense of justice that we share. For me, and also in light of this philosopher called Jean Nancy, this French philosopher who had a very beautiful line, and it's also epigram in this book on genocidal rape that I was reading, also to think about this. He talks about this. Let me quote from Jean Nancy. Justice is always the demand for justice, the complaint and protestation against injustice. In other words, justice is the call for justice, right? It's the call that cries out for justice and the breath that exerts itself for it. In other words, justice is a cry for justice. Justice is an absolute sharing of that experience of inviolation, right? So justice is almost like a post-injustice. Justice happens when we experience injustice. So what you hear is the cry. So we have the sort of sense of this, victims unable to speak for themselves for various reasons. Trauma, right? This humiliation, shame, right? So we are not talking about, okay, go on and tell us about what happened. No, we need to be able to hear. The task here is to hear what's happening in whatever language that is. So justice is a cry, right? And that's kind of what I want to sort of talk about. I mean, just draw attention to. So pay attention to what we haven't heard before, right? Second question is, this is to do with the modus operandus, right? I became very interested in the process of how this war crimes, especially sexual violence against bodies of women, are becoming so normalized as if that is part of the usual warfare, right? Expected. That, I think, is the most scary thing to think about, right? It's, again, a little bit of philosopher talking. Now, this is the thing. The second question and the task is this. Who can think against or through these barbarities that have become so banalized, if you like, so normalized, right? And what I see is that kind of operandus, right? Again, these soldiers are almost psyched up, right? And they go and destroy these women, right? Because they became almost the weapons of war themselves, right? Soldiers became the weapons of destruction, right? The bodies of women become the object that they need to destroy, and the bodies of women became the site for all these meanings, sacred, cultural, historical meanings, right, are stored, right? So what's really frightening is that repetition. We look at, from ancient time, Herodotus, if you look at ancient Greece, right, or the mythology, right, Helen of Troy, right? Think about that, right? Women's body become the object of what? Seizure, right? Then you also think about, for instance, Abu Ghraib, right? How the bodies were sexualized and violated, and that's part of war story, right? And so what I think is interesting and in a disturbing way that we have to think about is the process. How is it that we actually turn these individual bodies, right, into an object of destruction across the street, I mean, across the history, right? And that is a kind of modus operandus. Although it's specifically located in this particular, right, region and history, we should also pay attention to, right, stop it, right? So the element of it that I'm also interested in is look at the misogyny, the femicide, right? The sexualized, it's not simply gender, but it's gender-specific violence, right? It's the misogyny, right? Right?
Exactly.
Right? And so femicide, behind that we have to look at this misogyny as even peacetime a problem, right? When thinking about war, not at time of war, but during the peacetime, right? We have to pay attention to that operation, right? It's lurking in everywhere. So that's the second question that I wanted to draw attention to. Good. Now, the third one is, so the question is, how does a person become a woman, right? And how does a woman become an enemy? How does a woman become an object, right? This process of the operation, right, is what I think we should pay attention to. Lastly, just briefly, through this process of bringing history, theory, and stories, including mythologies together, we should really try and create this sort of archive of memories, right? It's as if we're trying to write a history that has hardly been written, right? So how do we rewrite that story that has hardly been written, right? We cannot say it has never been written. That will be a total lie, right? Right? Because it's stored in these individual memories, right? So the task is the archive, right? And the archive has to be done in a way that questions the very historicity, right, of our own engagement and implication in the process. And so that is sort of what I will say as a way of contributing to this conversation, and especially the whole, the kind of digging out the past, right? This task, right? And the mass grave. Again, we have mass grave, right? And it's illegal mass grave, you say. So how does that tell? You know, what does it tell us about, you know, this whole, the question of the complicity of law, right? In the operation of this kind of, you know, military regime, right? And so we have to be able to think outside the law, right, in order to be truly in the historical time. I guess that's sort of what I have to say in response to what I've just learned today. Hope that wasn't too...
We have a few minutes for the translation and then a couple of questions because we're running out of time. But, you know, we want to give our audience, you know, an opportunity for a couple of questions. Yeah.
Por tanto, lo que les quería presentar son 3 preguntas que se convierten en 3 tareas que creo que deberíamos llevar a cabo a la luz de lo que acabamos de escuchar. En primer lugar, me gustaría hablarles de estas atrocidades en masa, y es que la palabra en masa suena enorme, esta masividad del hecho de la guerra, algo incontable, algo gigante. Me gustaría hablar de nuevo desde la ignorancia y plantear la pregunta de que ¿quién puede hablar de estas atrocidades en masa frente a la ignorancia masiva de muchos de nosotros? Yo me preguntaba antes de llegar aquí por qué no sabía nada, ¿no? Y en el sentido en el que hablaba Martin Luther King, la injusticia aquí es injusticia en todas partes. Por eso creo que es importante que desarrollemos un sentimiento de solidaridad cognitiva y colectiva, y que intentemos ir caso por caso, singularizando cada una de las historias que hemos escuchado y muchas más, para que se oigan, para que se escuchen y la gente sepa de ellas. La segunda cuestión que me gustaría abordar es apelar a nuestro sentido compartido de la justicia. Un filósofo, Nancy, hablaba de que la justicia en sí misma es la demanda de justicia, es un grito, es un llanto para lograr justicia, y se produce cuando experimentamos algún tipo de injusticia. Por eso estas víctimas, muchas de ellas son incapaces de hablar por ellas mismas, por el trauma, por la posible represión. Necesitamos ser capaces de escuchar a esas víctimas. En tercer lugar, y en relación con el modus operandi del que hablaba Sonia, me gustaría preguntarles cómo es posible que la violencia sexual sea algo normal y común dentro de la guerra. ¿Cómo se ha podido banalizar tanto? ¿Cómo se ha podido normalizar tanto? Tenemos que intentar pensar más allá, a través de esas atrocidades. Los soldados se convierten en armas de destrucción y los cuerpos de las mujeres son los objetos que tienen que destruir, porque no son capaces de ver más allá de esa cosificación, reificación, normalización de la violencia sexual como parte de la guerra. Deberíamos pensar en el proceso por el cual convertimos los cuerpos individuales de estas mujeres en objetos que deben ser destruidos en todos los momentos de la historia y en todos los lugares de la geografía. Y hay que prestar atención a esto porque hay un valor subyacente, la cuestión de la misoginia, y es un problema en tiempos de paz, cuanto menos en tiempos de guerra, cómo una mujer acaba convirtiéndose en un objeto. Y por último, me gustaría concluir con la reflexión de que en este proceso de unir la historia, la teoría y las historias individuales de cada una de estas mujeres, el objetivo final debería ser crear un archivo de la memoria, crear esa historia que apenas se ha contado, que sí que está almacenada en las memorias individuales, pero cómo podemos hacerlo común para que no olvidemos y para que estas cuestiones no se vuelvan a repetir.
Gracias, Aida. Thank you so much. And then we will open it then for our audience for just one couple. Can you hear? It's okay. 2 questions, maybe. Yeah. Yeah, we have. Okay. Yeah, we have time for questions. But before people leave, I think that also in response to your response to the discussion is to think about what's going on today in New York City in the aftermath of Sandy. Okay, in terms of creating this solidarity here at home. That people are suffering and people are going through enormous conditions of extreme conditions without electricity, power, heat, and it's cold outside. So if we can create this cognitive solidarity, as you were saying, also, that we cannot miss this opportunity today to speak about what's going on also in New York City. So please, if people have questions, yes.
What happened to those committing those crimes?
Okay, so what happened? Do we have a microphone that we can go around? Okay. So, okay. Do you want to answer, Sonia, what's going on with perpetrators?
That's a very important question, and in general, there are already several cases where we have sentences against military members or members of civil patrols or former police agents or police chiefs who committed crimes against community. But there is actually one case against the former dictator Efraín Ríos Montt, and he was presented to the court on 26th of January, I think, because he lost his immunity on 14th of January this year. All these years, he was the dictator between 82 and 83, and all these years he had some political charge in the government, so he always had immunity. So he lost his immunity, and all these years he had this immunity. Different organization prepared very, very well his case. So he is in house arrest actually, and there are 2 cases against him. One of the Dos Eres case, he is accused of murdering, and the second is the genocide case against Ixil ethnic group in the highlands. So that's what I can share. So I think this is one of the greatest purpose of many, many survivors to get this man to the court.
Just to add to that, in terms of the perpetrators, I think it's also very important to question, the many layers of these perpetrators. You have the intellectual perpetrators and you have the material perpetrators. So there's a whole chain of command. These were military operations. Okay, it's always very important to think about that these were planned counterinsurgency campaigns against defenseless, unarmed populations. These women were not armed combatants, they were unarmed civilians. And so when we talk about perpetrators, I think it's important to recognize that who is the perpetrator? At the village level, the perpetrator at the local level, the intellectual level, there are many levels. And I think that what Sonia is pointing out to is the importance of bringing the big guys who actually masterminded all this, and because these were military war plans. You can download them. I don't think that they are in English, but you had several war plans that you can read, and you can actually read the instructions given out to soldiers. Of course, they are in disguised, but when you do the research, you cannot come out but anything but to conclude that these were deliberately done. There was nothing random here.
Do you want me to switch that?
Hi, talking about perpetrators, I would like to ask the question about, because we talk about this state, right? The dictatorship, the military dictatorship at every level committing all these atrocities, this violence specifically gender-based towards women. But we're talking about the military, the national police, we're talking about the material and the intellectual perpetrators. What I haven't heard is about U.S. intervention, the U.S. participation, which had a direct role in what all these perpetrators were doing. And I also wanted to mention that Guatemala is not that far from the United States geographically. So when we talk about things that happen around the world, let's just picture ourselves here in the United States. The only country we have between Guatemala and the United States is Mexico. It's in Central America, it's not that far. I'm actually from El Salvador, so I know exactly what happened in Guatemala because we had that happen in El Salvador as well. And I also wanted to hear about how much is the case of Jennifer Harbury known or talked about recently in Guatemala, because I know she's going after Rios Montt and other military generals a lot. She's still working really hard to going against them. Thank you. I don't know if you want me to say it in Spanish or not. No?
No, it's okay.
Okay.
I think we can have the translation. Thank you so much. Maybe we take one more question and then we give some feedback or answers. One more? Yes?
Hello, my name is Selwyn. I would like to find out if some of the soldiers were students of the School of the Americas.
Sure.
Because the Americas,
Yes.
where they train soldiers for South and Central America. I'm from South America myself. To go into their own countries and kill people. And that is a participation of the United States that glorifies war.
Yes. Sonia, do you want to address the part of the United States? Yeah. Okay. Yes. About the United States, as thank you so much for your questions and reflections. As I said from early on, I mean the history of the United States in Latin America didn't begin in 1954 when the CIA went and overthrew the government in Guatemala. The history of the intervention and invasion of and domination of the United States starts in the 19th century with the Monroe Doctrine, right, when it says the Americas for the Americans. And since then, right, as many of you know, the region is considered the backyard of the United States. Do as you wish, right? So profit of and exploit the resources and exploit people. And I think that what happened during the Cold War years is an example of that intervention and training of soldiers and providing the ideology by which it created a framework that then allowed this politics of going against their own people. And to me, that's one of the most perversely conceived plans of extermination, because the wars in Latin America were not between states. These were state violence against their own people. And therefore, what you have today, even today, after 30 years in Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Guatemala, El Salvador, is that perpetrators are the neighbors of my mother in Chile. They are the neighbors, they are the cousins of someone else, and you had to coexist with these people. So imagine what that has done to society in terms of normalizing violence. Here is the guy that I know raped my niece, and I have to go and stand online with him in the supermarket. I mean, there are cases, many cases, again, countless in mass, of cases in Chile where the victims find the perpetrator online on the supermarket. It's just so, and so again, you know, the questions of the United States that provided, again, you know, all the ideological framework of the internal enemy, that there was this idea of communists, those who are demanding better changes, demanding changes, become the internal enemy. So it was used as this excuse, really, to pacify the many social movements and uprisings throughout Latin America. What is incredible is to find the resistance of people like Virginia and like some of you today in this room who have been part of that struggle, and they broke the silence, and they didn't remain victims, but rather became survivors and carried on this struggle. I think that that's, to me, so amazing to bear witness as well. Before we go to a question, maybe we can give a little bit to our translator to do a summary for our friends in Guatemala and beyond.
La primera pregunta fue qué ocurrió con los criminales, y se ha explicado que hay una serie de casos en los que ya se ha dictado sentencia contra militares, miembros de las patrullas de autodefensa civil, policías, por crímenes contra la humanidad, y hay un caso en concreto del antiguo dictador, del que fue el dictador durante el año 82 y 83, Efraín Ríos Montt, que en enero de este año perdió su inmunidad y ahora mismo está en arresto domiciliario y acusado de dos causas, una por asesinato, por el caso de 2 R's, y otra por genocidio en las zonas de los altiplanos. Y se comentaba también que hay distintas capas de criminales. Están los criminales al nivel intelectual y al nivel material. No hay que olvidar que esto eran operaciones militares y había una cadena de mando. Eran movimientos contra la insurgencia planeados. Entonces, el criminal, ¿quién es? A nivel local, a nivel de la comunidad, a nivel intelectual, hay muchas diferencias. Pero es importante lo que Sonia decía, en cuanto a llevar ante la justicia a aquellos que idearon todo el plan, porque eran realmente planes de guerra, eran instrucciones disfrazadas, pero que si se leen con atención se pueden concluir que se trataba de cuestiones de acciones deliberadas, que no se dejaban al azar. Y luego un par de preguntas en relación con la intervención de Estados Unidos y el papel directo que ha podido tener en estas realidades, y en cuestión en relación con los soldados, si algunos de los soldados que participaron en estos movimientos venían de academias militares estadounidenses. Y en relación con esto, la respuesta es que la influencia de Estados Unidos en América Latina, en América Central, no es algo reciente, o en Guatemala no es algo reciente, sino que siguiendo la doctrina Monroe, América es para los americanos, y Guatemala, entre otras zonas, hará un lugar del que extraer recursos y donde explotar recursos, incluso explotar a la gente. Entonces Estados Unidos, desde la Guerra Fría, creó un poco el marco ideológico en la formación y en el entrenamiento de soldados de que hay un enemigo interno. Esos que están pidiendo cambios son enemigos internos, y la manera de pacificar estos movimientos sociales, estos alzamientos sociales, era el hecho de considerarlos enemigos internos. Y es verdaderamente trágico el hecho en muchos países de Latinoamérica de cómo estos criminales son vecinos, son familias, conviven diariamente con sus víctimas en la cola del supermercado. Es muy importante, por tanto, ver cómo en estas historias las víctimas no han permanecido siendo víctimas, sino que han alzado su voz, han roto el silencio y se han convertido en verdaderas supervivientes.
I think we have. Oh, I'm sorry. What is that? Si el caso de la Jennifer se escucha en Guatemala. Sí. And then we have time for one more question.
Well, of course, the case is very well known from two different points of view. One is that Jennifer Hubbard's husband was disappeared and murdered, so since then she is fighting for justice. So just for those who don't know, so she is very criminalized, and it's very usual that those who want to do a change in their society, and this was during the war, and they are doing it, they're still doing it. Those who are working on clarifying the crimes are criminalized, so they are seen like criminals, and she is attacked publicly in her efforts to clarify this case. And of course there is a big movement behind her, accompanying her and supporting her in her work. And the case doesn't just go against Efraín Ríos Montt. The case one of the responsible is Otto Pérez Molinas, the today's president of Guatemala. So the case is paralyzed now.
Thank you. So I understand exactly what's happening, and I am trying to work in a peace with Argentina, human rights that disappeared. I have yet to encounter within the information that was delivered today whether or not for the women in Guatemala, did you encounter, for example, cases of children being abducted, children being disappeared, children who may have been sold into other families? I did not, I'm thinking because of time constraint, it was not really conveyed, because I would like to marry both of the subjects in my thesis. And it's funny to say, so I'm thinking as well, Argentina would not be considered a genocide, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm learning here in Guatemala, it would be a direct genocide because it's the extinction of a certain group. So then there was another piece that was delivered on screen when women were asked publicly if they were raped. Right away, you could see the sense that there was a fear. And I just got a new topic right away, a second rape. So I don't know if this is something that is being explored. Just from the pictures that were depicted, it's showing that they're being just exploited again just by going after these women, and you're just going to ask a question, and fear of the unknown, I think now they're sealed. The mouths are shut, and now they've become dumb. And how do I go about this as an individual? Because now I am a man, and I'm a male, so now I am considered the enemy. How do I go and approach a female, someone that was mutilated, and say to them, tell me about your experience? Just the look of my body or my statue will transcend a closure. So I'm not sure if you've experienced this before in your work in Guatemala.
Thank you so much. With regards to the Argentinian case, I will just very briefly mention and invite you to our December 5th event. The Historical Memory Project is co-sponsoring the Mothers of the Disappeared from Argentina, December 5th, with the Holocaust Center from Queensborough College. Did I say it right? And Judge Carlos Rosansky, who is carrying out the trials of genocide in Argentina. That's December 5th, also a Wednesday, right here. So I invite you all to be here with us. So we are going. We have 3 case studies within the Historical Memory Project: Chile, Argentina, and Guatemala. So we're doing Guatemala and Argentina this year, and hopefully next year, when a new anniversary of the coup d'etat in Chile that overthrew President Allende and put Pinochet for over 17 years, 19 years. So was it a genocide in Argentina? I can give you a bibliography, and there is research that shows that there was a plan to exterminate groups from a legal perspective, but also from a sociological perspective. And Daniel Feierstein is doing a lot of work on establishing sociologically that there was genocide. And then in terms of the children disappeared in Guatemala?
Well, I just want to add one detail, that one of the definitions of genocide, it's not only the extermination of a group, it can be also the forced translation of part of a group to another group. So, and this applies in the case of the adopted children, for example. And of course, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of adopted children, mostly in the States, actually. And in the beginning, the army kept some children to take them like slaves to the military bases, or they took them home because they had no children in their family. So the children were raised by the perpetrators. But then they discovered that they can do good business with these children, and they sold many of these children who they kept alive in the massacres, and they built an illegal structure to give these children in adoption, and this structure is how do I say, it works recently. They maintain this structure. Actually, the International Commission, the International Commission Against Impunity from the United Nations, they published recently a report about that, because most of the adoptions of children in Guatemala are illegal still, and they use the same modus operandi they built during the war, and most of the country have already prohibited the adoption of children from Guatemala, except the States. So they still, a lot of children are here, and actually one of the few survivors of this Dos R's massacre case was found here like an illegal immigrant. He was raised by a military family, and they found him like through the research in the public prosecutor's office. So and he is one of the few witnesses, and he met his real father and is confronted with his story, like, I was raised by my father, and I discovered that he is not my father, he's the murderer of my family. So it's very strong. You can find this in the website. It's like Finding Oscar or something like this is this story.
Oscar, who is there from the massacre of Dos R's, no? The Dos R's massacre. He was here in New York City a month ago. We went to see him about a month ago, month and a half. The Soros Foundation, right around the corner, had him, invited him as a survivor of the massacre. About how many people died in the massacre of Dos R's? 200? 251 people, and he survived. And so he lives here in the States, and maybe next year we could invite him to give us his testimony as a survivor. So we'll finish with the translation and a round of applause.
Una pregunta sobre el caso de Jennifer Arbery. Es una persona muy conocida porque su marido desapareció y fue asesinado y ha estado luchando para conseguir justicia durante mucho tiempo. Y es algo muy curioso porque se criminaliza, se ataca públicamente a estas personas que están buscando justicia. Hay todo un movimiento de apoyo y de respaldo a esta mujer, pero el caso está absolutamente paralizado porque uno de los involucrados es Otto Pérez Molina, el actual presidente. En cuanto a una segunda pregunta en relación con niños que desaparecían o que quizá eran vendidos, porque es algo de lo que se habla en Argentina también, que es el ámbito de actuación de la persona que ha hecho la pregunta. Y también preguntaba si en el caso de Argentina estas cuestiones se considerarían genocidio o no. En el caso de Argentina sí que se está desarrollando investigación para demostrar que lo que ocurrió sí que es genocidio. Había un verdadero plan de exterminar a una serie de grupos y se está intentando demostrar no solo desde el punto de vista legal o jurídico, sino también desde el punto de vista sociológico. Y en relación con los niños, la cuestión del genocidio no solo es que haya un plan para exterminar a un cierto grupo, sino también forzar el movimiento de parte de ese grupo a otro grupo diferente. Y aquí es donde entra en cuestión la cuestión de los niños desaparecidos. En Guatemala se sufrió mucho la pérdida de niños. En un principio los militares se los quedaban para tratarlos básicamente como esclavos o para criarlos ellos porque ellos en sus propias familias no tenían niños, pero luego descubrieron que podían hacer negocio y empezaron a vender, y de hecho se creó toda una estructura para dar a estos niños en adopción que se ha mantenido hasta muy recientemente. De hecho, se ha hablado de un caso en la masacre de Dos R's en la que uno de estos niños desapareció y después de muchos años se ha tenido que enfrentar a la realidad de que el padre que lo crió no era realmente su padre, sino la persona que asesinó a su familia. Es una persona que vive aquí en Estados Unidos y que participó en un evento hace relativamente poco y que quizá podamos volver a traer en el futuro. Y en línea con eventos en el futuro, en el mes de diciembre, el mes que viene, vamos a coger aquí un evento con el juez Carlos Rosansky y las madres de los desaparecidos argentinos, a los que nos gustaría invitarles a todos.
So, in closing, please help me give a round of applause to our guests. And please, do not forget to sign. We have not attendance, but to keep you updated, and so that you can also help us continue bearing witness and breaking the silence over these atrocities. Yes. Please. Open the Veins. Yes, very good books. Very good. Yes. Thank you so much for coming today. And to our wonderful translator.